Slide, Understanding the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS. Video series. Video 2, How does the NDIS work? An AFDO Disability Loop Workshop.
Slide saying, Part 1, How does the NDIS work?
A view of presenters sitting at a table at the front of the room. She reads notes from a braille booklet.
Part 1 is how does the NDIS work? So first of all, we're going to talk about before the NDIS.
Slide saying, Before the NDIS. Image of a map of Australia with the states differently patterned.
So the NDIS started in 2013. And before that, each state and territory had really different support systems. They were all run in different ways and they had different names, they had different rules. They're all different from each other because they were run by their respective state or territory. And I'll just say state, but you know that I mean state and territory when I say that. So just before I go on to talk further about that, when I say disability support, that could mean a whole range of things. What are some examples that you can immediately think of what a disability support is? We've heard about one of them in this room at least already. Would anyone like to give an idea of what a disability support might be? So Jess, for example, is helping me out today. She's being my eyes. She's doing workshops set up for me. So Jess is being a support for me. A disability support might be personal care, like washing, dressing. It might be taking someone out. It might be technology. So there's a whole range of disability support. And people have been accessing support for a long time. But prior to the NDIS, it was this, different states had their own systems. And people had a lot of problems with these different support systems. For example, if people moved interstate, let's say they moved from Melbourne to Sydney, they suddenly found themselves not eligible for the support because they needed to apply. Again, they couldn't just keep getting the service before they had to reapply. And that meant long waiting lists. Often people had to reapply, then wait for a long time before they were deemed eligible to get the service in their new location. And that meant sometimes other people didn't move, even though they might have had to, maybe a new job or family circumstances changed, and they just didn't move because they were worried about losing their support. Another problem was that the disability systems weren't consistent, they weren't fair. Sometimes you might have someone in New South Wales that had to wait, let's say 6 months, but then they got $20,000 for their support. Whereas someone in Victoria may have had to wait a year, but get $25,000. So there was no rhyme or reason. It was just not making sense. They're all different for no good reason. Sometimes this difference came to be known as the postcode lottery because it really was based on where you lived rather than any other sensibility.
Slide asking, why is the NDIS needed?
So why is the NDIS needed? Well, people with disabilities and their families, they had a lot of problems, not just the ones that I mentioned about moving interstate, but there were long waiting lists even in your home place. Sometimes people had to wait for a long time and sometimes there was not even a service. You can imagine if someone was living in a rural area and they needed a certain service that maybe wasn't in that area. They couldn't get it. Sometimes people had to fight hard to get some service, let alone get what they really wanted or to get the service how they wanted it. Sometimes you may have even heard people were denied basic human rights, lack of really basic equipment such as a wheelchair or a hearing aid. People were being denied that. Or there was just inadequate funding around for them to get good personal care. So if you need a shower every day and you need to get help to get out of bed, to be fed, dressed, there were people, and it wasn't just a few, people were just having to be left stranded in bed for hours waiting for a support worker. And it's because there just wasn't enough funds around for people to get the services in an appropriate manner. They were rationed their services. You may have heard of therapies like speech therapy, behavioural therapy, physiotherapy. Have you heard of those therapies? Yeah. People were rationed those. So if you only got physio once a month, well, what difference, it may not have made a difference. So this is because, not out of any meanness, but just because there just wasn't the resources there to give people what they really needed. So people didn't have any choice and control. They couldn't choose what they got, how often they got it. There was just a lack of resources. So there was those issues. But then there were issues for families and carers, and the carers in the room may identify with this. There was little access to support for carers, such as information, such as respite. Respite being the ability for the carer and the person being cared for to take a break from each other. So the carers found themselves, and the family found themselves becoming very stressed and tired. And then also the service providers were finding that they just didn't have the resources, so they had to create waiting lists, and they were under pressure. So it wasn't good for the service providers either. So something really needed to change, and that change is called NDIS. So that's when the Act was introduced in 2012.
Production of the AFDO Disability Loop, Understanding the NDIS video series has been made possible with funding from the Victorian Government. AFDO would like to thank video participants and those who provided feedback on video drafts for their contributions. Video services, audio description and captioning by Angry Chair. Auslan interpreting by Auslan Services. Remember to visit disabilityloop.org.au.